On August the 4th, 2002, two 10-year-old schoolgirls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, went missing in the small Cambridgeshire village, Soham.
First, tonight's lead story, Candle in the Wind.
Welcome back, you're watching Sky News. Let's take you now to Soham.
The search for Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman has tonight been extended to fields near their primary school.
Their disappearance sparked the biggest manhunt Britain had ever seen. Worldwide media attention and even national heroes addressed the nation, asking for help to find the two little girls.
Come home. God is forgiven, just come home.
Britain held its breath, praying for the safe return. But 2 weeks later, the news we had all been dreading broke through. Holly and Jessica's bodies had been found. They had been brutally murdered, then dumped in the countryside, just miles from their homes. And the man responsible for their murders? He'd been in Soham all along. Ian Huntley knew his victims. He worked at their school. He had been helping the police in their searches and had even appeared on the national news, appealing for information on the whereabouts of the two missing girls.
When you've been through it, it's hard. Sorry.
Murderers are masters of deceit, public deceit and self-deceit. They are great self-deniers.
As far as I'm concerned, I want Ian Huntley to rot in hell.
If I'd have known he was going to do that to those two girls, I think I would have killed him. You know, it was terrible.
As we approach the 10th anniversary of Holly and Jessica's tragic deaths, what have we really learnt? And how can we ever stop another Huntley striking again? On Monday, August the 5th, 2002, reports that two little girls had gone missing in Soham started hitting the wires in newsrooms around the country. Sky News anchorman Jeremy Thompson remembers that morning and the events that followed.
We all woke up on that Monday morning to a story that was already starting to gather momentum. And by the time I came in to do my programme, it was already the biggest story of the day, 24 hours after the two girls had gone missing. It was one of those long, hot summer days when there perhaps wasn't a lot of other news around, but it seemed to catch the imagination. Everybody was drawn to this story.
A photograph taken just an hour and a half before the girls went missing was beamed around the world. And whilst the village community came together helping with the search, the girls' school became the police's HQ.
4 days into the story, and the girls were still missing. The police seemed to have no idea what was going on, where they'd gone. They'd just literally vanished into thin air. We decided that it was such a big story by then, 4 days in, we should go up and be based up there and actually anchor our programmes from Soham.
At the time, the sheer scale of it was really unheard of. It was the biggest police investigation the country had ever had. It was one of the smallest police forces which was engaged in that investigation, but they were collating material that was coming in from around the world.
For any Home Secretary, actually learning of the disappearance or the likely tragedy to children is the worst possible moment.
We're right in the heart of the village of Soham here. This is Red Lion Square, and we knew that the girls had set off from their home from a family barbecue, popped over the road to the tuck shop to get some sweets, and then they talked to the caretaker, Ian Huntley, who'd said that after he'd said cheerio, they'd walked on up here Clay Lane and probably ended up here in Red Lion Square, very much the centre of the village by the War Memorial. And that's where the trail had very much gone cold.
With the world's media now camped out in the small Cambridgeshire town and increasing pressure building to find the girls, it started to become clear that this case was too much for the small, inexperienced force to cope with, and cracks started to appear in the investigation. Detective Chief Inspector Martin Underhill was called in to help after his experience working on the notorious child abduction case of Sarah Payne.
I can remember when I met the senior investigating officer, his face was just an absolute picture of shock, horror. And I actually said to him, "Are you okay?" And he went, "No, I'm just so swamped by this. You know, what do I do?"
Panic started to set in as the case had not been given priority quick enough and the proper lines of investigation had not been put in place.
When you're dealing with a child abduction, we have what's called the golden hour, which is everything you capture in the first hour or the first few hours can actually dictate the whole of your inquiry. The problem with Soham is that those first few hours were lost.
There's no point in blaming individuals if they've not been properly trained and given the background and understand the enormity of the issues.
Although they had lost valuable time in the first stages of the case, Cambridgeshire police were quick to rule out who was not responsible for the girl's disappearance.
When a child goes missing, there are 9 different scenarios as to what could have happened, and about 3 of those scenarios involve the family. One thing that became very clear very quickly is that the families, the Chapman and Wells families, were not involved. You then realise that unless a terrible accident's happened, that somebody else, a third party, has been involved in the disappearance, abduction or possibly murder of these children.
Someone who was keen to help was a young man called Ian Huntley. He was the school caretaker and the boyfriend of the girl's favourite classroom assistant, Maxine Carr. He took the police to search the school and told them he was the last person to see Holly and Jessica.
About a week and a half into the mystery of where these girls had gone, it felt like the police inquiry had lost momentum. We decided to go up and again base our programs there, and we had a whole day of broadcasting. And the idea is we thought, well, maybe we can sort of breathe some life back into the inquiry, draw the public attention back onto the story. I tried to walk through the timeline of the last known movements of the 2 girls when they left the family barbecue, came over here to the little tuck shop in the sports hall at the village college, and then I thought we'd better talk to the last person to say they had seen her alive, and that of course was Ian Huntley, and I talked to him just outside his house in front of the village college there. How do we know they were here at 6:15? Well, we have an eyewitness. Ian Huntley here is a familiar figure. Evening, Ian. You're the school caretaker. The girls, Jessica and Holly, would know you, and they saw you on the front doorstep. What went on?
Well, I don't know the girls. I stood on the front doorstep grooming my dog down. She'd run away and come back a bit of a mess. They just came across and asked how Miss Carr was, as she used to teach them at St Andrews. I just said she weren't very good, as she hadn't got the job. And they just said, please tell her that we're very sorry. And off they walked in the direction of the library over there.
Ian Huntley, he was an odd cove, let's put it like that. He didn't look like a villain as such. I mean, there are very few people who have murderer written across their forehead, but, you know, there was something slightly odd about him, but it seemed a plausible explanation that he gave.
Watching Jeremy Thompson's interview, Ian Huntley comes across as a normal person. There's nothing to suggest in any way he's lying. He looks to camera, he's quite considered in what he talks about. He seems to be quite empathetic to what's going on, quite emotional as well. The reality is here's a man who's very accomplished at lying, had been interviewed numerous times by the police in the past, so knew exactly the procedures.
Sadly, offenders do like talking to cameras. It's been shown several times, and Huntley was no exception. He enjoyed doing that. He got a kick out of doing that, and it was a piece of history being made.
There's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
Download Veely today.
Huntley, like many offenders, had put himself in the location he wanted to be in.
Ian Huntley clearly had a very devious sexual interest in young girls, but young girls probably from around the ages of 10 up until the age of about 15 and 16. That was his predatory group of children that he went after, and he was very clear about how he approached those. He would approach them through friends, he would gain contact with them, and then he would spend a lot of time with them. He targeted a significant number of adult females as well, who he would meet through nightclub scenarios. So he was someone who was very much putting himself into a situation where he both offended against young children and offended against young adults. This is someone who used their power, who uses control, and very much uses adult influence in order to commit his offences against them, and commit significant number of offences over a number of years.
But there was much more to Ian Huntley's shadowy past, which portrayed a very different picture to the one he had just presented to the cameras. Before Ian Huntley and his girlfriend Maxine Carr moved to Soham, they lived in Humberside.
I was neighbours of Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr for about 18 months before they moved to Soham. He just stayed in his own house. His job was work, come home, maybe go to the shops, come home, and that was it. They didn't go anywhere. For a young couple, Ian and Maxine didn't even go to the local pub.
Marissa is going back to Scunthorpe, to the flat where she lived next door to Huntley and Carr.
When I first met Ian Huntley, he seemed to be a very quiet, charming chappy, go-lucky, and then over the months of knowing Ian, he ended up being a very nasty, violent person.
Huntley confided in Marissa and told her about the previous allegations which had led to the couple moving around the country.
Police turned up one night and I went round to Ian and Maxine's house. I said, "You okay?" And this is when it all come out to me. He was telling me, he said, "I was with this girl, she said I raped her and I didn't." He said, "I was locked up for a week. They were having a go at me, they were having a go at Maxine, so we moved somewhere else." So another young girl claimed that I was supposed to have raped her and gone to bed with her and I didn't. And Ian says the police came then. And then I says, and then we moved again, and this is how we were in Scunthorpe. I finished a 12-hour night shift. It was in the winter at 6 o'clock in the morning. I pulled up out here on my push bike and he was underneath my stairs and he made me scared and he asked me if I got 2 slices of bread and butter for him. That's the first time I really felt scared of Ian Huntley when he was doing that to me. It makes you wonder if he was watching me all the time when I was coming home at stupid hours in the morning from work.
It wasn't long after that Huntley's strange behaviour turned to violence, this time directed at Marissa's friend, Maxine.
One night I went out with the girls from work and I came home and I heard Maxine screaming. And Ian was shouting at her, "Shut up, you..." Can I use these words?
Yeah, yes.
He says, "Shut up, you slag." He says, "You're going to take this." "I don't want it, Ian. I'm not very well, Ian. I'm bleeding, Ian." "I'm telling you now, Maxine, you're here to serve me, Maxine." Yeah.
It's hard,
It is. When you've been through it, it's hard. Sorry. I couldn't take it anymore, so I went downstairs and I walked into their house and I hit Ian and grabbed Maxine and took her to my house and put her in my flat, away from him. And I said to Maxine, "You can't do this with Ian. You're a young kid. You miss your mum. You miss your sisters. Just go. If you need a train fare," I said, "from Grimsby from Scunthorpe, it's not a lot of money on the train. I'll give you the train fare. Just go." Just don't want to be here. It just hurts that knowing that he could have killed some people I know and killed somebody else's children instead. Don't want to be here. I can't do it.
Huntley took Maxine away from her friend, moved again just 10 miles away to Brigg, and changed his name to Nixon. Someone else that was to experience the caretaker's Jekyll and Hyde personality was garage owner John McLeod.
Christmas Eve, we was all getting ready for our Christmas drink. As we were shutting the doors down and everybody was ready to go, Ian Huntley pulled up, or Ian Nixon, sorry, as we knew him then, pulled up in a little red car, desperate because the car was running quite badly and he needed to get to Cambridge. And the look on his face, he was so desperate that you couldn't not help him, being as it was Christmas. The car was done, we got it running fine. I told Ian to come back and pay after Christmas because I needed to go. So he was happy with that. We shut the doors and that was it. I didn't expect to see Ian no more till after Christmas. And the night went on and it was getting on for about 12 o'clock at night. So I decided I needed to be going and getting home. I then left the local pub, and as I came out the pub, I heard this horrific screaming. As I came along here, he was on this side, she was on that side towards the door. He had her in a headlock and he was punching her like that on the same place in her face all the time. And between the time that I'd shouted, he was still hitting her while I was shouting at him. He was then shouting back at me, telling me to mind my own business and go. All the time this was happening, he hadn't stopped on the punches. He was still punching her. She was still screaming. And there was nothing else I could do. I had to go up the top of the stairs. Anyone would have gone up there. I had to get up there. But I wasn't ready for what happened at the top of the stairs. I mean, he literally threw her down like she was nothing and then came at me. He pushed me so hard that he'd actually hit the wall, and with that he fell down. And it was at that point, when I saw his face, I knew it was Ian, the same guy that I had just done the car for. And I could not believe how he was at the workshop to how he was now, you know. And then Maxine turned on me, you know, look what you've done to him. And I was in such a state of shock about that. I thought, you know, maybe these two deserve each other. Standing here looking and just, I don't know, it makes me feel like knowing that those two young girls died, you know, and if you had the chance and if you could go back again, I would have killed him. I think I would have had to have done. If you knew that you could have saved two young girls and let them live their life, you know, and knowing what a monster he was and how he was, I would have killed him. Anybody would have done the same.
There is a justification in Ian Huntley's head. He'll go through a process whereby he justifies it to himself, and he may indeed talk to other people and justify it. We can see through his pattern of offending behaviour and the way that he interacted with the young girls that on each and every occasion he was justified. And he was justified because, of course, he wasn't ever prosecuted. And therefore, as a result of that, it reinforced it in his distorted thinking that actually what he was doing was okay. But more importantly, what he was doing, he was going to get away with.
Murderers are masters of deceit, public deceit and self-deceit. They are great self-deniers. So you can look at them in the eye, and they've already persuaded themselves that they didn't do it.
In 2001, Ian changed his name back to Huntley and once again moved with Maxine to Soham to be closer to his father, leaving a history of violence and sexual abuse behind him. Maxine got a job at the local school, and Huntley soon followed, working as a caretaker. No one knew who he was or had any knowledge of his past.
Ian Huntley had, on a number of occasions, contacts with the police. The police had, for a time, kept a record of those contacts, but those records have been deleted. When you're dealing with someone involved in sexual offences against young women, one of the things you have to watch for is a developing pattern of behaviour. And that's why it's important to keep intelligence about someone like Huntley for maybe a bit longer than you would normally keep it to see whether this pattern develops. Because there was no record kept about Huntley, we weren't able to see the developing pattern.
The list of mistakes made by Humberside and Cambridgeshire Police continued. The caretaker should have been suspect number one. But what would haunt the police was the location they had based their investigations from.
The biggest thing we learnt with Sarah Payne was clear the ground under your own feet. In other words, you start at the centre and you work outwards, but you must make sure your feet are clear before you start moving out. And tragically, that went horribly wrong with Soham, because they set up their command centre at the school, which subsequently later, hindsight was to show, was where the children's clothing was found, where Huntley worked as the suspect, and possibly where the children actually were as bodies at some stage during the inquiry. So they never really had a chance to clear the right ground under their feet.
It was also later to transpire that the school hadn't checked out Huntley's references. Maxine Carr had used her influence to get him a job there. Huntley obviously had control over her, but did Maxine know where Holly and Jessica were?
This is where we set up our main presentation unit. This is where I did a lot of the live programs that day from the high street, a very noisy little high street here in the heart of Soham. This is where I interviewed Maxine Carr, right here on the pavement on the high street, in what turned out to be a rather revealing interview.
This is something I'll probably keep for the rest of my life, I think. It's what Holly gave me on the last day of term. She was very, very upset because I didn't get my job, and that's the kind of girl she was. She was just lovely, really lovely.
That's really very sweet, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it was just afterwards, when we came off air, that one of the producers said, you know, that was odd. Maxine Carr seemed to be talking about the girls in the past tense. And we all went, yeah, that's right. We played back the interview and we thought it was rather odd. And we thought, well, we'll go and talk to the police when they have a moment, when we next see them, and we'll talk through the interview. But they would have seen them anyway live on air, and I assumed that was already starting to play into their thinking about the case.
She may well have been giving something away. She may well have done it, you know, without any consciousness. But whatever it is, she clearly knew what had taken place to some degree, and that those girls had visited the address.
The next morning, the story became a runaway train, really. It was extraordinary, the pace at which it moved.
In the last few minutes, a 28-year-old man and a 25-year-old woman, both from the Soham area, have been spoken to by police officers and have agreed to give witness statements to us.
Within seconds, we knew that it was Huntley and Carr. Around 11:30 that night, I heard that they'd been let out, and I'd got Maxine Carr's phone number. So I gave her a ring and said, can I speak to Ian Huntley? He said, yeah, we're all right, thanks. We don't want to talk to you anymore, but we're out and we're going to our family's home.
Later that night, the police searched the caretaker's storage hangar and found the burnt remains of Holly and Jessica's clothes.
In the last few hours, a 28-year-old man and a 25-year-old woman have been arrested.
Then early on the Saturday morning, the police called a press conference and dramatically announced that 2 people had been arrested, and it was clearly Huntley and Carr, and this time they were being arrested in connection on suspicion of abducting and possibly murdering the 2 girls.
When 13, 14 days have passed, you know those children are alive. And so, before the bodies were found, I think everyone in the police force anyway knew these children weren't coming home.
And finally, a story of 2 missing girls that everybody had had some hope of ending happily was brought to a terrible conclusion. It was suddenly a murder inquiry.
On the 17th of August 2002, reports started to come through that 2 bodies had been found near RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk.
I was invited to the scene pretty early on because this would be important in terms of determining what to do and how to do it. And so, fortunately, the way the bodies were discovered, the scene and its immediate surroundings were left largely undisturbed, which was an advantage. So, for instance, it was possible to see an offender path into the ditch where they were discovered. The ditch was clearly not a very easy place to take forensic evidence from them. The weather at the time couldn't really have been much worse, and the weather since they disappeared, it was very warm, and on occasions it had been pretty damp. This had resulted in very rapid decomposition. The approach then was to try and identify by some means who the bodies were, because although there were two apparently small skeletonized bodies there, clearly it was important to determine it was actually Holly and Jessica, and there was some items of jewellery that we were able to identify positively as belonging to them.
A year later, on November the 3rd, 2003, the prosecution opened its case at the Old Bailey. Now underway, the trial would bring in a host of experts to prove Huntley was guilty.
The sheer scale of scientific investigation that was involved was unprecedented. Something in the order of 20 different scientific disciplines became involved. So just mastering the evidence and then putting it in a way that hopefully would make sense to people with no background in one or other of the disciplines involved was especially interesting.
It's one of those cases where it simply wasn't possible to determine a cause of death, so the cause of death for both of them was unascertained. There would be a range of possibilities. Clearly they had to have died by a mechanism that didn't leave much in the way of skeletal injury. Asphyxial deaths due to some form of neck compression are common, and of course would leave signs that couldn't be detected in a decomposed state.
The pathology was awful, and for the families to hear about the discovery of their children and what was involved must have been horrendous for them, and remains so, I'm sure. For those who were involved in that, equally traumatic, even as professionals.
It was apparent that the vegetation above the bodies had signs of quite localised fire damage, so overhanging branches, that sort of thing, had been scorched, and it was then apparent that some of the parts of the decomposing bodies had also been scorched. And this clearly indicated that there'd been an attempt to set fire to them. It was no doubt done with some forensic awareness. It was done with the intention perhaps of wanting to remove evidence. The problem is, and this is not uncommon, in trying to get rid of evidence or trying to do a clean-up, people actually produce much more damning evidence in doing that. And the fact that a place that he had access to had the burnt clothing attributable to the girls, I think with one of his head hairs on top of it, so in terms of sequence quite important, turned out to be rather damning evidence of itself.
Well, he'd covered his tracks very carefully, but what finally came in was material that showed that his car, the Fiesta, had gone down what became known as the deposition site. It was a highly unusual surface on that site, various chalk deposits, and we had those analysed and found pieces of those chalk deposits on the lower axles of the Ford Fiesta. And so that ultimately proved that it was his car that had been down the drove. And without him explaining how or why it had been there, the implication was obvious. And that, I think, is when he finally decided he had to concede that he was responsible for their killing and deposition.
But what about Maxine Carr? Did she know more than she had let on? And would she stay loyal to the man that made her a victim for so long?
Who can forget the very dramatic scenes in courtroom number 1 as Maxine Carr, giving her evidence from the witness box, broke down as she was questioned and said, pointing at Ian Huntley across the courtroom, "I will not be blamed for what that thing in that box has done to me or those children."
For some of what she said, it's difficult to say does one believe her or not, because when she was being interviewed by the press during the course of the investigations, much of what she said then was shown not to be accurate. everything she had was rooted in the school and her relationship with Huntley and the home that came with that. And so one begins to understand how decisions made perhaps in haste are regretted over time.
Clearly at some stage she did start to be more truthful. Now whether that was the entire truth, I don't know, and we will never know, but she clearly was more truthful at some stage. What caused her to do that? Maybe she had some kind of conscious feelings about the whole situation. Maybe she felt this is absolutely horrendous. Or maybe she was just simply throwing out a lifeline for herself.
So I don't applaud it and I don't approve of it, but one can perhaps begin to understand why somebody would preserve that which they thought they had.
Once all the evidence was in and the prosecution had interviewed everyone Huntley had been in contact with, everything pointed to one man.
By then, I think with him conceding that he had killed the children, but deciding to put forward an account to explain how those killings had come about, which, as far as he was concerned, didn't involve him being guilty of their murder.
Now with his back against the wall and without the support of his girlfriend, Huntley decided to tell his version of events.
The defence scenario was that the girls turned up at Huntley's door with one of them complaining of a nosebleed. They had then gone up to the bathroom to deal with the nosebleed, and this is when I think credibility was stretched. Somehow one of the girls had fallen into a bath of water and drowned. The other girl had screamed and been smothered in midair and then collapsed dead on the spot. So within a short space of time we had 2 dead girls in Huntley's bathroom. You couldn't really smother someone in midair, you'd have to force them up against something. And smothering has a certain amount of intention attached to it, I would suggest.
Whatever actually caused the first one to be killed, and they can't have been killed immediately together, one was killed before the other, I'm as persuaded as I can be that that part of his account was true. The killing of the first may not have been something he set out to achieve in itself. The killing of the second, unquestionably. That's the awful nature of what happened, because the second one would have known the fate of the first already, and that must have been horrendous.
Do you think he meant to kill the girls?
Unquestionably.
On the 17th of December 2003, the jury entered the court with their verdict.
The jury come back and the first one hears of it is when the foreman stands up and announces the results. So a moment of real drama. And you just hope as a prosecutor that the verdict is the one that you've worked to achieve.
Mr. Justice Moses, the trial judge, has made it, and I'm hearing that Ian Huntley has been found guilty of count 1, the murder of Jessica Chapman. Ian Huntley has been found guilty of the murder of Jessica Chapman and the murder of Holly Wells, again by a majority verdict, I am told, of 11-1.
Finally, sentencing was given. Huntley got 2 life sentences and Carr 42 months. She only served 21.
I thought he should get more than what he got. I'm sorry, but my opinion, I think life for life. And I still think to this day, because he's so cold, you will not ever find out what he did to them children. He was that, because he's got one above everybody else.
We don't believe the account that Huntley gave. There were undoubtedly elements of truth within it, but one can only hope that at some point in time he'll feel able to say what really happened and why.
I have nothing to say about Ian Huntley. Anything I could say would be unhelpful. I've took a view when I was Home Secretary, and I do now, that the murder and despoliation of children's lives is the most heinous crime of all. And I've said heartfelt things in the past. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I want Ian Huntley to rot in hell.
As the case drew to a close, it was obvious that Holly and Jessica had been let down by the system, and public and political outcry followed. Something had to be done to stop the next Huntley.
And that's why I asked Michael Bichard, now Lord Bichard, to take a look at this so that we could get a proper examination of how we could learn the lessons and how we could proceed for the future to stop such an incident ever happening again. We owed it to Holly and Jessica's families.
Sir Michael Bichard has the task of heading this inquiry, announced the day after Ian Huntley was convicted of the murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman.
What I was very surprised at, almost immediately, was to find out that we didn't have any routine electronic way of exchanging intelligence information between police forces, the 43 police forces in the UK. And that did shock me, because I thought with IT even 10 years ago that would have been in place. The two most important areas that we reported upon were, first of all, that there should be a police national database. Actually, there was quite a sophisticated way of searching information about vehicles, for example, but not about people. And that seemed to me to be entirely wrong. So we said the first priority is to get a police national database in place.
The Police National Database was launched in 2011. This vital policing tool allows all 43 territorial forces around the country to store and share intelligence.
And when we rolled out the database, for the first time the British Police Service could link up the intelligence that was held in individual systems, in individual police forces, in a way that it could be accessed directly by colleagues in other forces. It was a major leap forward. We often have been asked to consider what difference might the Police National Database have made to the Soham investigation. And I think everybody accepts that PND wouldn't itself have stopped Soham. It might well have stopped Ian Huntley from getting his job as a school caretaker.
We are now much better in dealing with paedophiles, especially cross-county travelling paedophiles. But sadly, Soham had to happen before that changed.
But some critics say that holding information can be dangerous, infringes on our human rights, and as a society we are becoming far too reliant on stored data.
The problem with the criminal record system is that the first step, what information are you making available, has become very blurred. It's not just convictions for serious offences that are being disclosed, it's a whole host of things. So unfortunately people are haunted by minor indiscretions in their teenage years, 10, 15 years later when they're applying for jobs, despite the fact that they actually pose no real risk. All people care about now is a bureaucratic process and making sure there is nothing whatsoever on your records check.
Anybody who's involved in the business of holding data about citizens needs to be careful to make sure that you're holding it for a good reason, that you're not just holding it just in case. And the privacy implications of the Police National Database have been a central feature of the programme right from the very beginning.
The other ongoing debate which Lord Bichard's inquiry raised was how do we decide who is fit to work with children?
Recommendations on vetting and barring were that we should have a register which simply set out those people who weren't qualified, able, appropriate to work with children. It was an attempt to produce something that was cleaner, less fragmented, less confused.
What we'd like to see is people actually using their own intelligence and their own judgment based on how they interact as to whether they can be trusted. And that's what we should be doing. And if you have a legitimate fear that someone does look uncomfortable, then use the checks to give you that extra information. This idea of the computer knowing everything about everyone and being able to make decisions is simply a very dangerous way of passing the buck and will ultimately not make children safer.
The vetting and barring system that had been set out by the Labour government was very clear and in fact had moved to a position where it was going to be very, very effective. The coalition government come in, they've put a halt on that, they said they're going to change it massively. My huge concern is that not only year down the road, we still don't know what those changes will be, they haven't been brought into place, so we're in a limbo. And more so, it's about money. The government have changed this vetting and borrowing because of money, and also because of those individuals out there who have come out and said, this impedes my freedom. Well, I'm sorry, if it takes 10 minutes to fill out a form, but it means a child is safe, then those 10 minutes are worth doing. And anybody who can stand there and say, I shouldn't be checked, I'll ask you a question, why?
Well, Bichard recommended a scheme called vetting and barring, which would have incorporated 9 million people in being registered. We didn't think that was the best way of safeguarding children, because in a way, by government taking the responsibility, doing this for employers, if you like, or organisations, it kind of alleviated the responsibility.
What I'm looking for is this issue of balance. I want it to be proportionate. I'm prepared to accept that we maybe went too far, but I don't think we must go too far the other way. There are a lot of people out there who should not be working with children in any circumstances. And I think as a society, we've got to take action to make sure they don't work with children.
Actually, person on the spot needs to be doing their job properly, needs to take responsibility. You know, a whole range of things that they do, like safe recruiting. Don't just accept a piece of paper from someone saying they're a wonderful employee and say you should employ them. Check their references, talk to the person, ask if there's any concerns. You know, doing your job properly. If you are in charge and have responsibility for safeguarding children, then you have to take that on and watch and be concerned about all the employment.
But the government's found it has very little power, because the people doing these checks are local councils, are sports clubs, and they do not want to be in a situation of hiring somebody who goes on to commit another Soham. So even though the government has recognised the system's out of control, the people who are actually implementing it don't want to take the risk on their reputation of not doing the checks. So we're at an impasse, unfortunately.
Government has got to realise that actually they are in a position to safeguard children, and by making these changes, they are putting children at risk.
Less than 2 years after the murder of the two little girls, the village college wanted the house that Huntley had lived in, the caretaker's house, demolished, but not just taken down. They had it reduced to rubble and dust and disposed of at a secret location so that the place couldn't become a shrine. Mementos couldn't be sold off for voyeurs of evil crimes like this. So all trace of the crime itself was removed from the face of Soham. But it's a thing that Soham will never forget.
The events of the summer of 2002 changed the way Britain is policed and the way we protect our children. But as we approach the 10th anniversary of Holly and Jessica's tragic deaths, what should we remember?
All these extraordinary cases, and there are not many of them, but they all bring something different to the public domain, and they raise conscience amongst members of the public, and we have to look at ourselves individually a little more carefully.
Soham had to happen. It needed something like Soham to make us realise and kickstart us into dealing with that loophole where a travelling paedophile was escaping notice and was going under the radar. Hopefully most children in this country now are safer and are protected. Soham has made society in this country better, and I hope Jessica and Holly will always be remembered for that.
We are in grave danger of going back before Soham if this vetting and barring system does not go ahead. And if we get into that situation, we're putting children at serious risk, and I will question whether or not we actually learnt very much from Soham.
It was a story that touched and terrified every parent in the land. That was one of the most telling things, one of the things that sticks in my mind, that maybe things will never be quite the same again after the Soham murder case.
Whatever the pressures from outside, whatever the, if you like, the fashions and trends between civil liberties and child protection, we always should be on the side of the child.